There is something uniquely effective about the subject of UFOs when the lights are low and the world has gone quiet, because few topics sit so neatly at the border between the documented and the disputed, between official records and private testimony, between what is seen and what can be explained. Tonight, we are not going to rush towards certainty, and we are not going to sprint into fantasy either. We are going to move slowly, carefully, and with a calm kind of curiosity through one of the strangest subjects of the modern age. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy Tinfoil Hat if you enjoy these long, thoughtful journeys into the unknown, and let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight, because there is something fitting about the idea that people in different cities, different countries, and different time zones can all lie back under the same sky and wonder about the same unexplained lights. UFOs, or as they are now often called in official language, UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena, have lived for decades in a strange cultural space, dismissed by some as misunderstanding, hoax, or folklore, and treated by others as evidence that something deeply important has been overlooked. The safest place to begin is with the obvious truth that unidentified does not mean extraterrestrial. That is the mainstream position, and it is a sensible one. Human perception is imperfect. Atmospheric conditions distort light. Radar systems produce anomalies. Secret military projects are often misidentified. Memory is unreliable, especially under stress. All of that is true. And yet, once those explanations are laid out, the topic does not disappear. In some ways it becomes more interesting, because after accounting for mistakes, exaggerations, and misidentifications, there still remains a residue of cases that refuse to settle neatly into ordinary categories. That residue is where the mystery lives. The modern UFO story, at least in the public imagination, is often traced back to the summer of 1947, when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 fast-moving objects near Mount Rainier. He described their motion in a way that led journalists to popularize the phrase flying saucers, and from that moment, the imagery took hold. Very quickly, the American public entered a new kind of age, one in which the sky was no longer just the domain of weather, stars, and aircraft, but of possibility itself. The mainstream interpretation of the Arnold sighting is straightforward enough. Perhaps he misjudged distance, speed, or shape. Perhaps what he saw was a natural phenomenon, or a cluster of ordinary objects viewed under unusual conditions. That explanation is not irrational. In fact, it is exactly the kind of explanation we should start with. But what makes the case historically important is not merely what Arnold saw, it is what happened next. Reports surged, newspapers amplified them, governments took notice. The military began to track, catalogue, and study sightings, not because they had concluded aliens were visiting Earth, but because in the early Cold War environment, anything unexplained in the sky represented a potential security concern. This is a key point that often gets lost. Governments do not need to believe in extraterrestrials to care about unidentified craft. They only need to worry that an adversary may possess technology they do not understand. That Cold War context matters more than many people realize. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States had every reason to fear surprise advancements from rivals. Radar was new enough to be imperfect, jet technology was evolving rapidly, and classified aerospace programs were becoming more ambitious. Under those circumstances, a mysterious object in the sky was not just a curiosity, it was a question with military consequences. This led to official investigations such as Project Sign, Project Grudge, and later Project Blue Book. Mainstream historians generally argue that these programs reflected routine intelligence work mixed with public pressure. In other words, the Air Force investigated sightings because that is what institutions do when enough reports accumulate and enough anxiety builds around them. Most cases, they concluded, had ordinary explanations. Misidentified stars, balloons, aircraft, temperature inversions, astronomical objects, optical illusions. Again, that is the reasonable starting point. But the very existence of these programs also planted a different idea in the public mind. If there was nothing there at all, why keep studying it? If the answer was always simple, why did the files remain so full, so complicated, and in some cases so unresolved? The speculative angle does not have to claim hidden spacecraft. It only has to ask whether official reassurances were sometimes designed less to reveal and more to stabilize, to prevent panic, protect secrecy, or avoid admitting uncertainty. One of the most interesting patterns in UFO history is that the phenomenon seems to evolve alongside human technology. In the airship wave of the late 19th century, strange objects were often described in terms that resembled the machinery people knew at the time. In the mid-20th century, they became discs, cigars, glowing spheres, metallic craft. As radar improved, accounts began to involve instrument confirmation as well as visual observation. In the satellite age, in the drone age, and in the era of infrared sensors, the language shifted again. A strict skeptic might say, this is exactly what we should expect if the phenomenon is largely cultural, a mirror reflecting each era's fears and inventions. People interpret the unknown through familiar categories. That is a powerful argument. But there is another possibility, quieter and more difficult to dismiss entirely, which is that the core phenomenon may be stable while our descriptions of it change, because human frameworks change. In that interpretation, the language evolves not because the mystery is invented, but because our ability to perceive and explain it is always limited by the vocabulary of the present moment. That does not prove anything extraordinary. It simply reminds us that human observation is filtered through expectation, and expectation can distort in more than one direction. Then there are the witnesses themselves. The mainstream caution here is essential. A witness can be sincere and still mistaken. This is one of the most important principles in the entire UFO discussion. Sincerity is not proof. Training is not immunity from error. Even pilots, radar operators, police officers, and military personnel can misread unusual conditions, especially at night, over water, at high altitude, or when viewing objects without clear reference points. And yet, the testimony of trained observers remains harder to dismiss casually than the testimony of anonymous passers-by. When experienced personnel describe objects performing maneuvers that appear to exceed known aerodynamic limits, people pay attention not because the conclusion is obvious, but because the source changes the weight of the question. Are they misperceiving something ordinary under extraordinary conditions? Are they observing classified domestic technology without knowing it? Are the sensors malfunctioning? Or are they documenting something genuinely outside current public understanding? Those are all valid possibilities. The careful approach is not to choose the most dramatic answer. It is to notice that sometimes none of the ordinary answers feels fully satisfying, and that discomfort becomes part of the mystery. This is where UFOs become more than a collection of stories. They become a study in institutional behavior. Over the decades, officials have alternated between dismissal and concern in a way that creates its own tension. Publicly, the topic was often minimized, even ridiculed. Privately, files were collected, panels were convened, briefings were held, and procedures were developed. The mainstream explanation for that contradiction is bureaucratic rather than cosmic. Institutions often downplay uncertainty in public while examining it seriously in private. That happens in many domains, not just this one. Governments dislike open-ended mysteries, especially ones that feed public speculation. But when that pattern repeats for decades, another question slowly emerges. Has the greatest source of UFO mythology been the phenomenon itself, or the uneven, contradictory way authorities have responded to it? In other words, perhaps secrecy has generated more belief than sightings ever could. Once people sense that information is being filtered, delayed, or selectively released, imagination rushes in to fill the gaps. Some of those imagined answers will be wrong, perhaps most of them. But the distrust itself does not arise from nowhere. It grows in the space between what institutions say and what they appear to do. The emotional power of UFOs also deserves attention, because it tells us something about why the subject persists. This is not just a mystery in the sky, it is a mystery about control. Human beings are comfortable when the categories feel stable. We know what aircraft look like, what planets look like, what weather looks like. We like the sense that the world is mapped, named, and understood. UFO reports disturb that comfort because they introduce the possibility that something can appear in plain view and still resist explanation. The mainstream mind answers by narrowing the event back into known categories. That light was Venus. That shape was a balloon. That radar return was clutter. Often, that is correct. But the alternative perspective asks a softer question. What if some small percentage of cases remain unexplained? Not because people are irrational, but because reality occasionally presents us with data that our current frameworks do not handle well. That question does not require belief in visitors from another world. It only requires intellectual humility, which may be even rarer. And perhaps that is the best way to begin this series. Not with certainty and not with declarations, but with humility. Because UFO history is littered with overstatement on every side. Some have insisted that every unexplained light proves alien contact, which is far too careless to be convincing. Others have insisted that every puzzling case must already have a mundane explanation, even when no specific explanation actually fits, which is a different kind of carelessness. Between those extremes is a calmer path. We can admit that many sightings are mistakes. We can admit that some may involve secret technology, flawed sensors, or distorted memory. We can also admit that there are cases which, even after scrutiny, remain unresolved in a meaningful way. And unresolved does not mean magical. It means unresolved. It means the file remains open. It means the sky has not given up all its answers. So tonight, as we settle into the first layer of this long investigation, the real secret of UFOs may not be hidden in one dramatic disclosure or one perfect piece of evidence. It may lie instead in the pattern itself: decades of sightings, official studies, public ridicule, private concern, witness testimony, sensor anomalies, and a persistent inability to close the subject for good. That pattern suggests not necessarily that the most extraordinary explanation is true, but that the phenomenon occupies a genuine blind spot in modern understanding. Maybe that blind spot will shrink with better sensors, better data, and less stigma. Maybe it will turn out to be a patchwork of human error and hidden technology. Or maybe, somewhere inside that patchwork, there really is a deeper unknown waiting patiently behind the noise. For now, all we can say with confidence is that the story is not as simple as believers want it to be, and not as settled as skeptics often pretend. And in that narrow space between dismissal and certainty, between the official answer and the unanswered question, is where our journey begins. As we move deeper into the subject, it helps to slow down and focus not on the loudest or most sensational claims, but on the cases that quietly resist easy explanation, even after careful scrutiny, because those are the ones that tend to reveal patterns rather than headlines. One of the most discussed modern examples comes from a series of encounters involving the United States Navy, where trained pilots and advanced sensor systems both recorded objects behaving in ways that seemed, at least on the surface, difficult to reconcile with known aircraft capabilities. The mainstream explanation for these events remains grounded and cautious. Sensor glitches are not unheard of. Radar systems can misinterpret signals. Infrared cameras can produce misleading images depending on angle, distance, and atmospheric conditions. Human perception, even among experienced pilots, can be affected by speed, lighting, and the absence of clear reference points in the sky. These are all valid considerations, and they must be taken seriously before anything else is entertained. But once those explanations are applied, something interesting happens. In some of these cases, multiple systems, radar, infrared, and direct visual observation, appear to align, at least according to the reports. That alignment does not prove anything extraordinary, but it does complicate the idea that each incident can be reduced to a single simple error. One of the most well-known of these encounters is often referred to as the Tic Tac incident, involving pilot David Fravor. The mainstream interpretation suggests that what was observed could have been a combination of sensor misreading and a distant object behaving in ways that only seemed unusual due to perspective. That is not an unreasonable hypothesis. At high speeds and long distances, even ordinary motion can appear abrupt or unnatural. However, what keeps this case in ongoing discussion is not just the visual account, but the reported consistency between different forms of detection. Pilots described an object with no visible wings or propulsion system, moving rapidly and responding in ways that suggested awareness, while radar operators tracked unusual movements before and after the visual contact. Again, none of this forces a conclusion. It simply raises a question that remains open. When independent systems appear to confirm something unusual, how likely is it that they are all misinterpreting the same ordinary object in the same way at the same time? It is possible. But it is also statistically interesting, and that is often where the conversation becomes more analytical than dismissive. Another widely discussed case is the so-called gimbal video, also recorded by Navy personnel. The mainstream explanation here leans heavily on the idea that the apparent rotation of the object may actually be an artifact of the camera system itself, particularly the way infrared sensors track heat signatures and adjust orientation. This explanation has strong support among analysts who study imaging technology, and it demonstrates something important about UFO cases. Sometimes the mystery lies not in the object, but in the tools used to observe it. Technology can clarify reality, but it can also introduce new layers of ambiguity. And yet, even here, there is a lingering question that continues to circulate quietly. If the rotation is a camera effect, what exactly is the underlying object that the camera is tracking? Is it a conventional aircraft seen under unusual conditions? A distant jet whose heat signature is being distorted? Or something else entirely that simply does not match familiar profiles? The official stance does not leap beyond what can be proven, but it also does not fully close the case in a way that eliminates curiosity. What makes these modern encounters different from earlier UFO reports is not just the credibility of the witnesses, but the gradual shift in how institutions respond to them. In recent years, organizations like the Pentagon have acknowledged that there are objects observed in controlled airspace that remain unidentified after analysis. That phrasing is careful, and it is worth paying attention to the wording. Unidentified does not mean unknown in an absolute sense. It means not currently identified within the available data. This distinction matters because it keeps the discussion grounded while still allowing for uncertainty. The creation of groups such as the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office reflects a practical need rather than a philosophical one. If objects are appearing in restricted airspace and behaving unpredictably, they must be studied, regardless of their origin. The mainstream explanation is that this is about national security, air safety, and intelligence gathering. And that explanation is strong. But the speculative question, again framed carefully, is whether the increase in official attention represents a change in the phenomenon itself or simply a change in how openly it is being discussed. There is also an interesting shift in terminology that reveals something subtle about how the subject is evolving. The move from UFO to UAP is not just a rebranding exercise. It reflects an attempt to remove cultural baggage from the discussion. UFO carries decades of association with science fiction, conspiracy theories, and public skepticism. UAP, on the other hand, is deliberately neutral, almost clinical. It invites analysis rather than reaction. From a mainstream perspective, this shift helps researchers approach the topic without the noise of preconceived ideas. But from another angle, it also suggests that institutions are trying to reframe the conversation in a way that allows more serious engagement without triggering the immediate dismissal that often follows the older term. Language shapes perception, and perception shapes what questions are considered acceptable to ask. If we step back and look at the broader pattern, something begins to emerge that is less about any single sighting and more about the structure of the phenomenon itself. Reports tend to cluster around certain environments, military training areas, coastlines, regions with advanced radar coverage, places where both observation and detection are more likely to occur. The mainstream interpretation is straightforward. You see more anomalies where you are actively looking for them, especially with sensitive equipment. That makes sense. But there is also a quieter question embedded within that pattern. Are these objects appearing more frequently in such areas, or are these simply the places where they are most likely to be noticed and recorded? In other words, is the phenomenon shaped by observation, or is observation revealing something that is already there but usually invisible to us? Another layer to consider is how little we actually know about the limits of current technology, particularly classified systems. It is entirely plausible that some UFO sightings represent advanced human-made craft that have not been publicly disclosed. This explanation often appeals to those who prefer a grounded answer without invoking anything beyond Earth. Secret programs have existed for as long as aviation itself, and history has shown that experimental aircraft can remain hidden for years, even decades. But this explanation also raises its own set of questions. If such technology exists, why would it be tested in ways that risk exposure to military personnel who are not briefed on it? Why allow repeated encounters that generate confusion and official reports? There may be practical answers to those questions, involving compartmentalization, operational necessity, or simple miscommunication. But again, the pattern does not settle into a single, clean explanation. It branches into multiple possibilities, each of which explains part of the picture without fully explaining all of it. And this is where the topic begins to slow down in a way that suits our exploration tonight. Because the deeper you look into UFO cases, especially the more credible and well-documented ones, the less dramatic the conclusions tend to become, and the more persistent the questions feel. It is not a story of sudden revelation. It is a story of accumulation, small uncertainties stacking on top of each other over time, cases that do not quite fit, data that does not fully resolve, explanations that work in isolation but strain when applied collectively. The mystery is not a single moment of shock. It is a long, quiet tension between what we can explain and what we cannot quite close. So as you lie there, letting the details settle slowly, it may be worth considering that the real intrigue of UFOs is not whether they are extraterrestrial or not. That question, while fascinating, might actually be too narrow. The deeper question is what these persistent anomalies reveal about the limits of observation, the boundaries of technology, and the ways institutions manage uncertainty. Because even if every single case were eventually explained in entirely conventional terms, the process of getting there would still tell us something profound about how we interpret the unknown. And if even a small fraction of cases remain unexplained, then the story continues, not as a conclusion, but as an open thread stretching quietly into the future. As we continue, it becomes useful to shift away from individual sightings for a moment and instead examine how information about UFOs has been filtered, shaped, and sometimes constrained over time. Because the mystery is not only in the sky, but also in the way the subject has been handled here on the ground. If you trace the history carefully, a pattern begins to emerge, not of a single hidden truth waiting to be revealed, but of a conversation that has been carefully managed, redirected, and at times quietly discouraged. The mainstream explanation for this is not particularly dramatic. Governments, especially during the Cold War, had strong incentives to control narratives that could cause public anxiety or expose sensitive capabilities. Unidentified objects in the sky could easily be misinterpreted as enemy technology or trigger unnecessary fear. In that context, downplaying the phenomenon publicly while investigating it privately makes a certain kind of sense. It is not necessarily evidence of a deeper secret. It may simply reflect a preference for stability over speculation. One of the most frequently cited moments in this history is the Robertson Panel, convened by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1953. The panel reviewed UFO reports and concluded that most sightings could be explained through conventional means. But what is often overlooked is that their recommendations extended beyond analysis. They suggested that public interest in UFOs should be reduced, in part through education and, interestingly, through the involvement of media and authoritative voices to steer perception. From a mainstream perspective, this was a rational response to a growing cultural phenomenon that risked spiraling into mass hysteria or distraction. In the early Cold War environment, where psychological stability was considered part of national security, managing public attention was seen as necessary. But when viewed from a slightly different angle, this moment introduces a subtle tension. If the goal was not only to understand the phenomenon, but also to shape how people thought about it, then the line between investigation and narrative control becomes less distinct. This tension becomes more noticeable when we look at how ridicule entered the conversation. For decades, the topic of UFOs was often treated not just with skepticism, but with a kind of casual dismissal that discouraged serious discussion. Scientists avoided it. Pilots hesitated to report sightings. Witnesses risked being labeled unreliable or attention-seeking. The mainstream explanation for this is straightforward. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and without such evidence, the subject did not merit serious attention. That principle is foundational to scientific thinking, and it serves an important purpose. But the side effect of that cultural stance is that it may have suppressed data rather than clarified it. If credible observers choose not to report what they see for fear of reputational damage, then the data set itself becomes incomplete. And when the data set is incomplete, conclusions drawn from it may be less reliable than they appear. Over time, this created what some researchers describe as a feedback loop. The lack of high-quality reports reinforced the perception that there was nothing worth studying, which in turn discouraged high-quality reporting even further. From a conventional viewpoint, this is simply how fringe topics fade away when they lack evidence. But in the case of UFOs, the topic never fully faded. It persisted at the edges, occasionally breaking back into mainstream awareness, often triggered by new data, declassified documents, or credible testimony. Each time it returned, it carried with it the same unresolved tension. Too much uncertainty to dismiss entirely, but not enough clarity to confirm anything extraordinary. The release of previously classified information over the years has added another layer to this pattern. Documents related to programs like Project Blue Book, along with more recent disclosures, show that governments have consistently taken the phenomenon seriously enough to monitor it, even when publicly minimizing its significance. The mainstream interpretation here is again rooted in practicality. Any unidentified object in controlled airspace is, by definition, a potential concern, regardless of its origin. Monitoring does not imply belief in exotic explanations. It implies responsibility. But for those who look at the broader pattern, the question becomes slightly more nuanced. If the phenomenon were entirely understood and fully explainable within known categories, would it continue to generate such sustained, quiet attention over decades? Or does the persistence of investigation suggest that there are aspects that remain genuinely unresolved? Another interesting shift has occurred in the way information is now shared compared to earlier decades. In the past, UFO reports often filtered slowly through official channels, media coverage, and word of mouth. Today, with global communication networks and widespread access to recording technology, sightings can be documented and distributed almost instantly. This has increased the volume of data dramatically, but it has also introduced new challenges. The mainstream explanation emphasizes that more data does not always mean better data. Digital artifacts, misidentified drones, edited footage, and deliberate hoaxes are easier to produce and harder to verify than ever before. The signal-to-noise ratio has become more complex. And yet, within that noise, there are still cases that attract attention not because they are viral, but because they are supported by multiple forms of evidence and credible witnesses. What is particularly interesting is how official language has adapted to this new environment. Statements from agencies such as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration have begun to acknowledge that while many UAP cases can be explained, some remain unidentified due to limited data or incomplete analysis. This is a subtle but important shift. It does not suggest hidden knowledge or dramatic discoveries. It simply acknowledges uncertainty in a way that was less common in earlier decades. From a scientific perspective, this is a healthy development. Admitting uncertainty is a necessary step toward resolving it. But from a broader perspective, it also changes how the public engages with the topic. When institutions move from dismissal to cautious acknowledgement, the conversation itself becomes more open, more measured, and perhaps more productive. There is also a psychological dimension to all of this that is worth considering as we move forward. Human beings are naturally drawn to mysteries, but we are also uncomfortable with ambiguity. We tend to resolve uncertainty quickly, either by accepting the most familiar explanation or by embracing the most intriguing one. UFOs resist both tendencies. They are too persistent to ignore and too elusive to define. This creates a kind of cognitive tension that keeps the subject alive across generations. Each new piece of information is examined not in isolation, but in the context of everything that came before it. Patterns are searched for. Connections are proposed. Sometimes those connections are meaningful. Sometimes they are coincidental. The challenge is to distinguish between the two without losing sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, at least for now, remains incomplete. We have decades of reports, investigations, and analysis. We have credible witnesses and advanced sensor data. We have official statements that acknowledge uncertainty without leaping to conclusions. And we have a cultural history shaped as much by skepticism and ridicule as by curiosity and belief. All of these elements coexist, and none of them fully resolves the question. Instead, they form a kind of landscape, a quiet, complex terrain where facts, interpretations, and unknowns intersect. So as we settle further into this exploration, it may help to think of UFOs not as a single mystery waiting to be solved, but as a series of overlapping questions. Questions about perception, questions about technology, questions about how information is managed and shared, and perhaps most importantly, questions about how we respond to the limits of our own understanding. Because in the end, the most interesting aspect of the phenomenon may not be what is in the sky, but what happens here on the ground when we realize that we do not yet have all the answers. As we continue to move slowly through this landscape, it becomes useful to focus on a different kind of case, one that doesn't rely primarily on modern sensor systems or recent military encounters, but instead sits quietly in the historical record, returning again and again because it resists clean explanation even after decades of analysis. One such case is the incident near Roswell in 1947, which has become almost inseparable from the broader UFO narrative, not because it provides clear answers, but because it highlights how information can shift, fragment, and evolve over time. The mainstream explanation today is well established. What crashed near Roswell was most likely debris from a classified high-altitude balloon project, often associated with Project Mogul, designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. This explanation is supported by declassified documents and aligns with the technological context of the era. Balloons equipped with reflective materials and unusual structural components could easily be misidentified, especially by those unfamiliar with their design. From a grounded perspective, this resolves the case in a practical and historically consistent way. But what keeps Roswell in the conversation is not simply the initial event. It is the sequence of statements that followed. At first, there was a press release from the military claiming the recovery of a flying disc, which was then quickly retracted and replaced with the explanation that it was a weather balloon. That rapid shift, even if it can be explained by miscommunication or misunderstanding within the chain of command, introduced a layer of uncertainty that has never fully faded. The mainstream interpretation suggests that lower-level personnel may have misidentified the debris and that higher authorities corrected the error once more information became available. That is a plausible scenario, especially in a time when communication channels were less streamlined than they are today. But the alternative perspective does not need to assume anything extraordinary to raise a question. It simply asks why the correction was so abrupt and why the messaging seemed to move from certainty to dismissal in such a short span of time. Was it confusion, or was it an early example of narrative control in response to an unexpected situation? As the decades passed, Roswell transformed from a relatively obscure incident into a cultural symbol, largely due to witness testimonies that emerged many years later. Some individuals claimed to have seen unusual materials, others spoke of debris fields extending across large areas, and a few described more dramatic elements that went far beyond the initial reports. The mainstream response to these later testimonies is cautious and often skeptical, and for good reason. Human memory is not a fixed recording. It changes over time, influenced by new information, cultural narratives, and personal reflection. When accounts are given decades after an event, they must be evaluated with care. Details can become sharper in some ways and less reliable in others. Stories can merge, expand, or unintentionally incorporate elements from outside sources. This does not mean that witnesses are being deceptive. It means that memory itself is a dynamic process, not a static one. And yet, even when we apply that understanding, the persistence of the Roswell story reveals something deeper about how certain events take hold in the collective imagination. It is not just the possibility of what happened that matters, it is the structure of the story itself. An unusual event, an initial claim, a rapid retraction, and a long period of limited information, followed by later revelations and reinterpretations. This pattern creates a kind of narrative tension that is difficult to resolve. From a conventional standpoint, the case can be explained through misidentification, secrecy surrounding classified projects, and the natural evolution of memory over time. But from a broader perspective, Roswell becomes less about a single incident and more about how uncertainty is managed and how stories grow in the spaces where information is incomplete. If we step away from Roswell for a moment and look at other historical cases, a similar pattern begins to emerge. Consider sightings reported over Washington, D.C. in 1952, where radar operators and pilots observed unidentified objects over restricted airspace. The mainstream explanation for these events often points to temperature inversions, atmospheric conditions that can create false radar returns and visual distortions. This explanation is supported by known physical principles and has been applied to other radar anomalies with reasonable success. But once again, the pattern complicates the picture. In some instances, visual sightings appeared to coincide with radar detections, creating a situation where both human observers and instruments seem to be registering something unusual at the same time. That does not invalidate the atmospheric explanation, but it does introduce a layer of complexity that keeps the case from feeling entirely settled. What becomes increasingly clear as we examine these historical incidents is that UFO cases often exist at the intersection of multiple uncertainties rather than a single clear mystery. There is uncertainty in perception, uncertainty in instrumentation, uncertainty in communication, and uncertainty in memory. Each of these factors can contribute to the overall picture, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes creating contradictions. The mainstream approach is to resolve each layer individually, to find the most likely explanation based on available evidence. This approach is methodical and necessary. But the speculative perspective, again framed as a question rather than a conclusion, asks whether there are cases where these layers of uncertainty overlap in ways that cannot be fully disentangled. In those cases, the mystery does not arise from one unknown, but from the interaction of many. Another aspect worth considering is how these cases influence each other over time. Once a particular type of sighting enters public awareness, it can shape how future sightings are reported and interpreted. This is known as a kind of cultural feedback loop. For example, after the popularization of flying saucers, more reports began to describe disc-shaped objects. This does not necessarily mean that the objects themselves changed. It may simply reflect the way language and expectation guide perception. The mainstream explanation sees this as evidence that the phenomenon is largely psychological and cultural. But the alternative question is whether the core stimulus, the thing being observed, remains constant, while the descriptions shift to fit the observer's framework. If that were the case, then the variability in reports would not negate the phenomenon, but rather obscure it. There is also a quieter, more subtle pattern that appears when we look across decades of reports. Many of the most compelling cases do not involve dramatic landings or clear close-up encounters. Instead, they involve brief observations, unusual movements, or objects that appear and disappear without clear explanation. These are not the kinds of events that provide definitive answers. They are the kinds that leave behind incomplete data and lingering questions. From a scientific perspective, these are frustrating cases because they lack the repeatability and clarity needed for firm conclusions. But they are also the cases that tend to persist, precisely because they resist easy dismissal. They do not offer enough detail to confirm an extraordinary explanation, but they also do not fit neatly into ordinary categories. And so, as we let these ideas settle, the picture that emerges is not one of a single hidden truth waiting to be uncovered, but of a long, evolving interaction between observation and interpretation. Historical cases like Roswell, Washington, and many others do not stand alone. They form a kind of continuity, a thread that runs through decades of human experience, shaped by technology, culture, and the limits of understanding. The mainstream explanations provide important clarity, grounding the discussion in known principles and documented evidence. But the persistence of certain questions suggests that the story is not entirely complete. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of all is how these cases encourage a particular kind of thinking, one that is neither fully skeptical nor fully convinced, but attentive, patient, and willing to sit with uncertainty. Because in the end, The mystery of UFOs may not be something that resolves suddenly or dramatically. It may be something that unfolds slowly, piece by piece, as new information emerges and old assumptions are revisited. And until that process reaches some kind of conclusion, if it ever does, the phenomenon remains what it has always been: a quiet, persistent question, suspended somewhere between the known and the unknown, waiting to be examined just a little more closely. As we move further into this quiet investigation, it becomes important to turn our attention toward a category of encounters that sits somewhere between historical record and modern documentation. Cases that involve not just distant lights or fleeting radar returns, but closer observations that introduce a different kind of tension into the conversation. These are often referred to as close encounters, and while the term itself carries a certain cultural weight, the underlying reports vary widely in detail, reliability, and interpretation. The mainstream explanation for many of these cases is grounded in psychology and perception. Under conditions of stress, fatigue, or unfamiliar environments, the human brain can construct interpretations that feel entirely real but are influenced by expectation, fear, or incomplete sensory input. This is particularly true at night, where depth perception is reduced and the mind fills in gaps with patterns it recognizes. Sleep-related phenomena, such as hypnagogic hallucinations or sleep paralysis, have also been proposed as explanations for some of the more vivid accounts. These are well-documented experiences, capable of producing sensations of presence, movement, and even interaction, all while the individual remains partially conscious. From a scientific standpoint, this provides a powerful framework for understanding why some encounters feel so personal and so convincing. And yet, even within this framework, there are cases that continue to invite careful attention, not because they defy explanation outright, but because they involve multiple elements that are difficult to align perfectly within a single conventional model. One of the most frequently discussed examples is the incident in Rendlesham Forest, often described as one of the most credible UFO events in the United Kingdom. The mainstream interpretation of this case suggests that what was observed could have been a combination of natural and man-made sources, including a nearby lighthouse, bright stars, and possibly misinterpreted ground lights. These explanations are not only plausible, but supported by known environmental factors in the area. However, what makes the case linger in discussion is the involvement of multiple military personnel, the documentation of their observations, and the apparent consistency in certain aspects of their reports. This does not confirm anything extraordinary, but it does create a situation where simple explanations must account for a more complex set of observations than usual. When we examine cases like this, it becomes clear that the challenge is not just identifying what was seen, but understanding how different layers of perception, environment, and expectation interact in real time. A light in the distance may appear to move due to shifting perspective. A stationary object can seem dynamic when viewed against a dark background with no reference points. Even the act of focusing attention on something unusual can alter how it is perceived. These are well-established principles in psychology and optics. But when multiple observers report similar details independently, the analysis becomes more nuanced. Are they reinforcing each other's perceptions through shared context? Are they observing the same stimulus under similar conditions? Or are they each interpreting slightly different inputs in ways that converge into a consistent narrative? These are subtle distinctions, and they are not always easy to resolve. Another aspect of close encounters that deserves careful consideration is the role of physical evidence, or rather, the frequent absence of it. Many reports include descriptions of landing traces, unusual markings, or environmental effects, but these are rarely documented in ways that allow for definitive analysis. The mainstream explanation often points to the difficulty of preserving and verifying such evidence, especially when incidents occur in remote or uncontrolled environments. Soil disturbances, for example, can have multiple causes. Burn marks may result from ordinary human activity. Without controlled conditions and immediate documentation, it becomes nearly impossible to draw firm conclusions. This lack of verifiable physical evidence is one of the strongest arguments against more extraordinary interpretations, and it is a point that cannot be easily dismissed. At the same time, it raises an interesting question about the nature of the phenomenon itself. If something unusual is occurring, why does it so often leave behind ambiguous traces rather than clear, measurable artifacts? This question leads into a broader consideration of how UFO encounters are structured. Unlike many scientific phenomena, which can be observed, measured, and replicated, UFO sightings tend to be transient and unpredictable. They appear briefly, often without warning, and then disappear, leaving behind only testimony and, occasionally, partial data. From a conventional perspective, this is exactly what we would expect if the phenomenon is largely the result of misidentification and chance. Random events do not follow predictable patterns. But from another angle, it creates a situation where the phenomenon, whatever its nature, remains just beyond the reach of systematic study. It is not that it cannot be observed at all, but that it resists the kind of observation that leads to definitive answers. There is also an interesting psychological dimension to close encounters that goes beyond simple misperception. Many witnesses describe a sense of heightened awareness, a feeling that something is not just present, but somehow focused on them. The mainstream explanation for this often involves the brain's natural response to ambiguity and potential threat. When confronted with something unfamiliar, the mind becomes hyper-alert, scanning for meaning and intent. This can create the impression of interaction, even when none exists. It is a survival mechanism deeply embedded in human cognition. But when similar descriptions appear across different cases, it invites a quieter question. Are these experiences shaped entirely by internal processes, or is there an external stimulus that consistently triggers them in similar ways? The answer may lie somewhere in between, but it is not easily separated into clear categories. As we continue to examine these encounters, it becomes increasingly clear that the phenomenon operates in a space where multiple explanations can coexist without fully resolving the underlying question. Psychological factors, environmental conditions, and technological limitations all contribute to the complexity of the cases. Each provides a piece of the puzzle, but none seems to complete it entirely. This does not mean that the answer is extraordinary. It simply means that the process of understanding is incomplete. And perhaps that is where the true intrigue lies, not in the idea of hidden craft or unknown visitors, but in the persistent gap between observation and explanation. If we step back once more and look at the broader pattern, close encounters add an important layer to the overall picture. They bring the phenomenon closer to human experience, making it more immediate and more difficult to dismiss as distant or abstract. At the same time, they introduce new challenges in terms of reliability, verification, and interpretation. The closer the encounter, the more personal it becomes, and the more it depends on individual perception. This creates a paradox. The most vivid cases are often the hardest to validate, while the most verifiable cases are often the least detailed. Navigating this paradox requires a careful balance, one that neither accepts every account at face value nor dismisses them without consideration. And so, as the night deepens and the details begin to settle into a quieter rhythm, it may be worth considering that close encounters do not necessarily bring us closer to a final answer. Instead, they deepen the mystery in a different way, shifting it from distant observation to personal experience, from abstract data to subjective reality. They remind us that the unknown is not always something far away, moving silently across the sky. Sometimes it is something that appears briefly, unexpectedly, and leaves behind not evidence, but a question. one that lingers, not because it demands belief, but because it resists easy explanation. As we continue to settle into this exploration, it becomes helpful to shift our attention toward a quieter but deeply important layer of the UFO phenomenon: patterns over time. Not individual sightings, not isolated encounters, but the way reports, descriptions, and characteristics seem to repeat, evolve, and occasionally align across decades in ways that are difficult to ignore, yet equally difficult to interpret. Because if there is one place where this subject becomes less about spectacle and more about careful observation, it is in the patterns that emerge when enough cases are placed side by side. The mainstream approach to patterns is cautious by design. Humans are naturally inclined to see connections, even where none exist. This tendency, often referred to as apophenia, can lead us to group unrelated events into meaningful clusters simply because they share superficial similarities. Lights in the sky, unusual movements, unexplained radar returns. These can all arise from different causes that only appear connected when viewed from a distance. From this perspective, the patterns in UFO reports may reflect the way human cognition organizes information rather than the presence of a single underlying phenomenon. It is a compelling argument and one that has strong support in psychology. But when the dataset becomes large enough, and when certain characteristics recur across different times, locations, and contexts, the question becomes more nuanced. At what point does a pattern move from coincidence to something that deserves closer examination? One of the most commonly noted patterns involves the movement of these objects. Across many reports, spanning decades, there are descriptions of sudden acceleration, sharp directional changes, and the ability to hover without visible means of propulsion. The mainstream explanation for these observations often points to misjudgment of distance and speed. Without a clear reference point, an object moving steadily can appear to accelerate rapidly. A distant aircraft turning gradually can seem to change direction abruptly. Atmospheric conditions can distort perception, creating the illusion of motion where there is none. These explanations are grounded in well-understood principles, and they account for a significant portion of reported behavior. But what becomes interesting is when similar descriptions appear not just in visual sightings, but in conjunction with radar data or multiple independent observers. Again, this does not confirm anything extraordinary. It simply adds weight to the question of whether all such cases can be explained through perception alone. Another recurring pattern involves the environments in which sightings occur. Many reports cluster around bodies of water, particularly coastal regions and large lakes. The mainstream explanation for this is straightforward. These areas often coincide with military training zones, shipping routes, and regions of high observational activity. In other words, we see more where we are already looking more closely. That makes sense. But it also raises a subtle question. If observation increases detection, does that mean the phenomenon is evenly distributed and only appears clustered due to human attention? Or does it suggest that certain environments are more likely to produce or reveal these anomalies? It is a small distinction, but one that changes how the pattern is interpreted. There is also the pattern of duration. Many UFO sightings are brief, lasting only seconds or minutes before the object disappears, changes direction, or simply fades from view. The mainstream interpretation sees this as consistent with transient events, objects passing through a line of sight, reflections of light that shift with movement, or momentary atmospheric effects. These are naturally short-lived and do not lend themselves to extended observation. But there are also cases where objects are tracked for longer periods, sometimes across multiple detection systems, before vanishing in ways that are not easily explained. These longer duration events are rarer, but they tend to attract more attention because they provide more data, more opportunity for observation, and yet still end without resolution. It is in these cases that the pattern becomes less about fleeting anomalies and more about sustained uncertainty. If we move beyond physical characteristics and look at the timing of reports, another layer begins to appear. Sightings often increase during periods of technological advancement, particularly when new detection systems are introduced. The rise of radar during World War II coincided with reports of unexplained aerial phenomena, sometimes referred to as Foo Fighters by pilots. The development of infrared tracking and satellite monitoring brought new kinds of observations, each adding complexity to the data set. The mainstream explanation here is again grounded and logical. New technology reveals things that were previously invisible, including both real objects and new types of errors or artifacts. As our tools improve, so does our ability to detect anomalies, whether those anomalies are meaningful or not. But this also suggests that the phenomenon, whatever it may be, is not static. It interacts with our ability to observe it. It becomes visible, not just when it exists, but when we develop the means to notice it. There is also a pattern in how these events are reported and recorded. In many cases, sightings are initially described in simple terms: lights, shapes, movements, before becoming more detailed as they are revisited, analyzed, and discussed. This is a natural process. As more information is gathered, descriptions become more refined. But it also introduces the possibility of retrospective interpretation, where later understanding influences earlier accounts. The mainstream perspective treats this as a cautionary factor, a reminder that reports evolve over time and must be evaluated in their original context. At the same time, it highlights how the narrative of UFOs is not fixed. It is continuously shaped by new data, new interpretations, and the ongoing effort to make sense of what has already been observed. Perhaps one of the most subtle patterns of all is the persistence of uncertainty itself. Despite decades of investigation, technological advancement, and increased openness in recent years, the phenomenon remains unresolved in a fundamental way. This does not necessarily mean that the answer is hidden or extraordinary. It may simply reflect the complexity of the subject, the limitations of available data, and the inherent difficulty of studying transient, unpredictable events. But it also raises a question that sits quietly beneath the surface of all these patterns. If the phenomenon were entirely the result of known causes, would we expect it to remain so consistently unresolved over such a long period of time? Or does the persistence of uncertainty suggest that there are aspects of the phenomenon that we have not yet fully understood? As these patterns begin to settle into a broader picture, the tone of the discussion shifts almost naturally. It becomes less about isolated mysteries and more about a continuous process of observation and interpretation. Each new case adds a small piece to the puzzle, but the overall image remains incomplete. The patterns guide us, but they do not lead to a final destination. They point toward possibilities, highlight inconsistencies, and reveal areas where our understanding is still developing. And so, as you let these ideas drift slowly through your mind, it may help to think of UFOs not as a single question, waiting for an answer, but as a kind of long-term signal, faint, intermittent, and difficult to decode. A signal that appears across different contexts, shaped by the tools we use to observe it and the frameworks we use to interpret it. Whether that signal ultimately resolves into something familiar or remains something genuinely new is not something we can determine just yet. But the patterns themselves are real, and they invite us to keep looking, to keep questioning, and to remain comfortable in that quiet space where curiosity and uncertainty meet. As we continue drifting deeper into this quiet examination, it becomes necessary to explore one of the most delicate and often misunderstood aspects of the UFO subject, the role of science itself, not as a final authority that has solved the mystery, but as a framework that both illuminates and limits what we are able to understand. Because while UFOs are often discussed as if they exist outside the boundaries of science, the truth is more subtle. The phenomenon, whatever it ultimately turns out to be, is filtered through scientific tools, scientific language, and scientific skepticism. And that filtering process shapes not only what we know, but what we are willing to consider. The mainstream scientific position on UFOs has remained consistent for decades, and it is grounded in a principle that is both simple and essential. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is not a dismissal. It is a safeguard. Science advances by building on verifiable, repeatable observations. If something cannot be reliably measured, tested, or reproduced, it becomes extremely difficult to study within the traditional scientific method. UFO sightings, by their nature, present a challenge to this system. They are unpredictable, often brief, and rarely leave behind data that can be independently verified under controlled conditions. From this perspective, the lack of strong scientific conclusions about UFOs is not surprising. It is exactly what we would expect when the available evidence does not meet the threshold required for firm analysis. But this is where the conversation begins to open slightly, not in contradiction to science, but in recognition of its boundaries. There are phenomena throughout history that were once poorly understood, not because they did not exist, but because the tools and frameworks needed to study them had not yet been developed. Ball lightning, for example, remained a largely anecdotal phenomenon for centuries before it began to receive more systematic attention. Certain atmospheric and plasma effects were once dismissed simply because they were difficult to replicate. The mainstream lesson here is not that UFOs are similar to those phenomena, but that scientific understanding evolves over time, often in response to persistent anomalies that resist easy explanation. The presence of unexplained cases does not confirm anything extraordinary, but it does create an opportunity for further investigation if approached carefully. One of the more interesting developments in recent years is the gradual re-engagement of scientific institutions with the topic, including studies supported by organizations like the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. These efforts are cautious, data-driven, and intentionally limited in scope. They focus not on proving or disproving dramatic claims, but on improving methods of detection, classification, and analysis. The goal is not to solve the mystery all at once, but to reduce uncertainty step by step. From a mainstream perspective, this is exactly how science should approach any ambiguous phenomenon. Start with what can be measured. Improve the tools. Refine the data. Avoid speculation beyond what the evidence supports. But even within this careful approach, there is an implicit acknowledgement that the subject has reached a point where it can no longer be ignored entirely. Not because it has been validated, but because it remains unresolved. There is also a deeper philosophical question that emerges when we consider how science interacts with the unknown. Science is incredibly effective at explaining phenomena that can be observed consistently and under controlled conditions. But it is less effective when dealing with events that are rare, unpredictable, and difficult to isolate. In those cases, the absence of explanation does not necessarily mean the absence of a phenomenon. It may simply reflect the limitations of the current method. This does not weaken science. It highlights the importance of expanding methods and remaining open to new approaches when existing ones reach their limits. Another factor that complicates the scientific study of UFOs is the issue of stigma, which has already shaped the conversation in subtle ways. For many years, researchers who expressed interest in the topic risked being associated with fringe ideas, which could impact funding, publication opportunities, and professional reputation. The mainstream explanation for this is rooted in academic standards. Fields that lack strong evidence are often avoided to maintain credibility and focus on more productive areas of study. But the side effect of this caution is that potentially valuable lines of inquiry may be underexplored. If few scientists are willing to engage with the data, then the data remains limited and the cycle continues. This is not unique to UFOs. It has occurred in other areas of research as well, where initial skepticism delayed broader investigation. In recent years, there has been a subtle shift in this dynamic. The conversation is becoming more structured, more disciplined, and less influenced by extremes. Instead of asking whether UFOs represent something extraordinary, researchers are beginning to ask more precise questions. What are the characteristics of these observations? How reliable are the detection systems? What environmental factors might contribute to misidentification? How can data collection be standardized across different platforms? These questions may not be as dramatic, but they are far more useful. They move the discussion away from conclusions and toward understanding. There is also an interesting interplay between scientific analysis and technological advancement that continues to shape the field. As sensors become more sophisticated, as data processing improves, and as observational coverage expands, the quality of information available increases. This has two important effects. First, it allows more sightings to be explained with greater confidence, reducing the number of truly unidentified cases. Second, it sharpens the focus on those cases that remain unexplained, making them more distinct and, in some ways, more intriguing. The better we understand what something is not, the more clearly we can define what remains. At the same time, it is important to remain grounded in the reality that uncertainty does not imply hidden knowledge waiting just out of reach. There is a natural tendency to fill gaps in understanding with assumptions, especially when the subject itself invites speculation. But the careful approach is to resist that impulse, to allow the unknown to remain unknown until there is sufficient evidence to move beyond it. This can feel unsatisfying, particularly in a topic that has captured the imagination for so long. But it is also what keeps the exploration honest. And perhaps that is where the true value of this part of the journey lies. Not in arriving at a conclusion, but in understanding how we approach questions that do not yet have answers. UFOs, in this sense, are not just a mystery in the sky. They are a reflection of how we think, how we investigate, and how we respond to uncertainty. They challenge us to balance skepticism with curiosity, to remain open without becoming uncritical, and to recognize that the absence of a clear answer is not a failure, but a starting point. So as the night continues and the details begin to soften into a steady rhythm, it may be worth considering that the scientific perspective on UFOs is not a closed door, but a slow-moving process, one that advances carefully, question by question, observation by observation. Whether that process eventually leads to a complete explanation or reveals something unexpected is not something we can determine yet. But the path itself, the careful, methodical effort to understand, is already unfolding quietly in the background of a mystery that has been with us for far longer than most realize. As we continue, it becomes useful to explore a layer of the UFO subject that sits quietly beneath the sightings, the reports, and even the scientific analysis. The role of governments not just as observers, but as interpreters of the phenomenon, shaping how it is understood both internally and publicly. Because while UFOs are often framed as a mystery in the sky, they are equally a matter of policy, communication, and control here on the ground. And when you begin to look closely at how different governments have approached the subject over time, a pattern emerges that is less about secrecy in the dramatic sense and more about cautious management of uncertainty. The mainstream explanation for government involvement is straightforward and, in many ways, unavoidable. Any unidentified object entering controlled airspace represents a potential risk. It could be foreign technology, a surveillance platform, or even a misidentified domestic system. Regardless of the source, it requires attention. This is why organizations within defense structures have consistently monitored and analyzed such events. The creation of modern programs, like the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, reflects this practical need. Their purpose is not to confirm extraordinary theories, but to catalog, analyze, and, where possible, identify objects that could pose a threat or require further understanding. From this perspective, UFOs are less a mystery and more a category of unresolved data points within a broader security framework. But when we look beyond the functional explanation, something more subtle begins to take shape. Governments do not simply collect data, they also decide how that data is presented, when it is released, and how it is framed. This is not unique to UFOs. It is a general feature of how institutions operate, particularly when dealing with incomplete or sensitive information. The challenge arises when the public narrative and the internal handling of a subject appear to diverge. Historically, UFOs were often dismissed in public statements, while internal documents suggest a more sustained level of interest. The mainstream interpretation is that this reflects a desire to prevent unnecessary speculation or panic, and that explanation holds weight. But it also introduces a quiet tension. When information is filtered or delayed, even for practical reasons, it can create the impression that something more is being withheld. This dynamic becomes even more interesting when we consider how different countries have approached the topic. Some governments have been relatively open, releasing files and encouraging limited scientific engagement, while others have maintained a more reserved stance. The variation suggests that there is no single global approach to the phenomenon, only a shared recognition that it exists in some form and requires at least occasional attention. From a conventional standpoint, this diversity of response supports the idea that UFOs are not a unified or coordinated phenomenon, but rather a collection of independent events interpreted through different cultural and institutional lenses. But it also raises a quieter question. If the phenomenon were entirely mundane and fully understood, would we expect such variation in how it is handled? Or would the responses converge more consistently over time? Another aspect worth considering is how classification plays a role in shaping the narrative. Many technologies that were once classified later became public knowledge, often years or decades after their initial development. Stealth aircraft, advanced radar systems, and experimental propulsion technologies all existed in secrecy before eventually being revealed. The mainstream explanation for UFO sightings often includes the possibility that some of these events are misidentified classified projects. This is a reasonable and historically supported idea, but it also introduces a layer of complexity. If some sightings are indeed linked to undisclosed technology, then the boundary between known and unknown becomes less clear. What appears unexplained to one observer may be entirely understood within a restricted context. And yet, this explanation cannot account for all cases, particularly those that span different countries and time periods where shared technology is less likely. There is also the question of timing, specifically when information is released and why. In recent years, there has been a noticeable increase in official acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena. Reports have been published, videos have been confirmed as authentic recordings by military personnel, and statements have been made that openly admit the existence of unexplained cases. The mainstream interpretation of this shift is tied to changes in policy and transparency. As stigma decreases and data collection improves, there is less reason to avoid the topic entirely. Additionally, modern threats such as advanced drones and hypersonic systems make it necessary to maintain awareness of anything unusual in the sky. But from another perspective, the timing itself becomes part of the pattern. Why now? Why this gradual movement from dismissal to cautious acknowledgement? Is it simply a reflection of changing priorities, or does it indicate that the volume or quality of data has reached a point where it can no longer be easily set aside? This brings us to an important point about how uncertainty is managed at an institutional level. Governments are generally not structured to deal comfortably with open-ended questions. Their systems are designed to assess, categorize, and respond. When faced with something that does not fit existing categories, the initial response is often to integrate it into the closest available framework. In the case of UFOs, this has typically meant treating them as either misidentified objects or potential security concerns. But when cases remain unresolved, they occupy a kind of administrative grey area. They are documented, analysed, and then often left without a definitive conclusion. This does not mean they are ignored. It means they are acknowledged as unresolved within the limits of current understanding. And perhaps this is where the most interesting insight begins to form. The way governments handle UFOs may tell us as much about the phenomenon as the sightings themselves. Not because it reveals hidden truths, but because it reflects how structured systems respond to ambiguity. There is a balance between investigation and reassurance, between transparency and control, between acknowledging uncertainty and maintaining stability. This balance shapes the narrative in ways that are not always immediately visible, but become clearer when viewed over time. So as the night continues and the details begin to settle into a quieter, more reflective space, it may be helpful to think of UFOs not just as objects or events, but as part of a larger interaction between observation, interpretation, and institutional response. The mystery is not confined to what is seen in the sky. It extends into how that information is processed, shared, and understood here on the ground. And within that process, there is a kind of quiet complexity, one that does not point to a single answer, but instead reveals a system continuously adapting to something it does not yet fully understand. As we continue to drift deeper into this exploration, it becomes time to look at one of the more subtle and often overlooked dimensions of the UFO subject, the way it intersects with human perception of reality itself. Not in a philosophical or abstract sense, but in a grounded, observational way that asks a simple question. When people report seeing something they cannot explain, what exactly are they experiencing? And how much of that experience belongs to the external world versus the internal processes of the mind? The mainstream scientific view begins with a principle that is both humbling and essential. Human perception is not a perfect recording of reality. It is an interpretation. The brain constantly processes incomplete sensory data, filling in gaps, correcting inconsistencies, and constructing a coherent picture of the world based on past experience and expectation. This process works remarkably well in everyday life, but it can become less reliable in unfamiliar or ambiguous situations. Low light, unusual angles, high speeds, and lack of reference points all increase the likelihood of misinterpretation. In the context of UFO sightings, these conditions are not exceptions. They are the norm. Most sightings occur at night, at a distance, and under circumstances where clear visual information is limited. From this perspective, the prevalence of unexplained observations is not surprising. It is a natural outcome of how perception operates under uncertainty. But as we've seen throughout this journey, the story does not end there. Because while individual perception can be flawed, patterns of perception across multiple observers introduce a different kind of question. When several people report seeing something unusual in the same place at the same time, the likelihood of a purely internal explanation begins to decrease, though it does not disappear entirely. Shared environmental conditions can produce similar perceptual effects. A bright planet near the horizon can appear to move erratically when viewed through shifting atmospheric layers. A distant aircraft can seem to hover or accelerate depending on the observer's motion. These are well-documented phenomena, and yet, when reports align not just in general description, but in specific details, shape, movement, duration, it becomes more difficult to attribute everything to coincidence or individual misinterpretation. This leads us into a more nuanced space, where perception and reality interact in complex ways. There is a concept in psychology known as perceptual convergence, where different observers, exposed to the same ambiguous stimulus, arrive at similar interpretations. This does not mean the interpretation is correct. It means that the human brain tends to resolve uncertainty in consistent ways. In UFO cases, this could explain why certain shapes, disks, spheres, triangular forms appear repeatedly across independent reports. These shapes may not reflect the true structure of an object, but rather the way the brain organizes unfamiliar visual input into recognizable patterns. The mainstream explanation finds strong support here. It suggests that the consistency in reports is not evidence of a consistent external object, but of consistent internal processing. However, there is a quieter question that sits alongside this explanation. If perception alone accounts for these patterns, why do they sometimes coincide with instrument-based detections? Radar returns, infrared signatures, and other sensor data are not subject to human interpretation in the same way visual perception is, although they are not immune to error either. When both human observers and technical systems register something unusual, the explanation becomes more layered. Are the instruments misreading environmental conditions in ways that align with human perception? Are both systems responding to the same external stimulus, but interpreting it differently? Or is there a combination of factors at play, each contributing to a shared but incomplete picture? Another important factor to consider is the role of expectation. What we believe, or even what we have been exposed to culturally, can influence how we interpret ambiguous experiences. Over the decades, the imagery associated with UFOs has become deeply embedded in popular culture. Films, books, and media representations have created a visual language that people draw upon, often unconsciously, when describing what they see. The mainstream perspective views this as a strong argument against the reliability of UFO reports. If people are primed to interpret unusual lights as structured craft, then their descriptions may reflect expectation rather than observation. This is a valid concern, and one that must be accounted for in any serious analysis. But expectation does not operate in isolation. It interacts with sensory input, memory, and context in ways that are not always predictable. There are cases where witnesses report seeing something that does not fit familiar cultural patterns, something that feels distinctly outside their expectations. These reports are not necessarily more reliable, but they introduce variation into the dataset that is harder to attribute solely to cultural influence. Again, this does not confirm anything extraordinary. It simply complicates the picture in a way that resists a single, uniform explanation. There is also the phenomenon of time distortion, which appears in some UFO reports. Witnesses sometimes describe events that seem to last longer or shorter than they actually do, or sequences of observation that feel disjointed or unclear. The mainstream explanation for this lies in the way the brain processes novel or stressful experiences. When confronted with something unusual, attention becomes highly focused, and the perception of time can shift. Moments may feel extended, or details may be remembered out of sequence. This is not unique to UFO encounters. It occurs in many situations where the brain is trying to make sense of unfamiliar stimuli. But when combined with other elements, visual observation, environmental factors, and emotional response, it can create experiences that feel deeply significant and difficult to reconcile with ordinary explanations. As we step back and look at this layer of the phenomenon, it becomes clear that perception is not just a filter through which UFOs are observed. It is an active participant in the experience itself. The external stimulus, whatever it may be, interacts with the observer's mind in real time, producing an interpretation that is shaped by both input and expectation. This does not mean that UFOs are purely psychological. It means that the boundary between external reality and internal processing is more complex than it first appears. And perhaps this is where the subject becomes most quietly intriguing, because it suggests that the mystery of UFOs is not located solely in the sky, nor solely in the mind, but in the interaction between the two. A fleeting light, an unusual movement, a moment of uncertainty, these are simple elements on their own. But when they pass through the lens of human perception, they become something more, something that invites interpretation, analysis, and sometimes lasting curiosity. So as you let this idea settle, gently and without urgency, it may be worth considering that understanding UFOs requires not only looking outward, but also looking inward, examining the tools we use to interpret the world, the assumptions we bring to unfamiliar experiences, and the ways in which perception can both reveal and obscure what is actually there. Because until we fully understand how we see, it becomes much harder to understand what we are seeing. As we continue this slow and careful descent into the deeper layers of the UFO subject, it becomes time to explore one of the most grounded, yet often overlooked possibilities: the role of advanced human technology, not as a convenient dismissal, but as a serious and historically supported explanation that deserves thoughtful attention. Because long before UFOs became a cultural mystery, human innovation in flight was already moving faster than public awareness could keep up with. And that gap between capability and disclosure has, at times, created conditions where the unfamiliar appears almost otherworldly. The mainstream explanation that many UFO sightings may be linked to classified or experimental aircraft is not only plausible, it is supported by history. During the Cold War, projects like the Lockheed U-2 and later the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird operated at altitudes and speeds that were far beyond what most people believed possible at the time. Pilots flying commercial routes would occasionally report strange lights or objects moving at extreme heights, unaware that they were observing aircraft designed to remain undisclosed. From their perspective, these objects behaved in ways that did not match known aviation technology. From a classified perspective, they were entirely understood. This gap between observation and knowledge created a natural environment for misidentification, not through error, but through incomplete information. This pattern raises an important and often underexplored question. How much of what is labeled as unidentified is simply unrecognized? In other words, how often are observers encountering technology that exists within human capability but outside public awareness? The mainstream answer leans toward this explanation for a significant portion of cases, especially those occurring near military training areas or testing grounds. It is a logical and grounded interpretation. But as with many aspects of this subject, it does not fully resolve every detail. Some reported behaviors, instantaneous acceleration, lack of visible propulsion, extreme maneuverability, do not easily align with publicly known or even historically classified aircraft. That does not mean such capabilities do not exist. It means that if they do, they represent a level of advancement that has not yet been disclosed or widely understood. There is also the matter of technological progression itself. Innovation in aerospace does not happen in sudden leaps that are immediately visible to the public. It occurs incrementally, often in secrecy, with prototypes, experimental systems, and testing phases that can span years or decades. The mainstream perspective emphasizes that what seems extraordinary from the outside may simply be the result of gradual development, reaching a point where it begins to intersect with public observation. Hypersonic vehicles, advanced drone systems, and novel propulsion concepts are all areas of ongoing research. Some of these technologies are already known, while others remain speculative or classified. The boundary between what is possible and what is publicly acknowledged is not fixed. It shifts over time, and occasionally, that shift creates moments where the unfamiliar becomes visible before it is explained. But this explanation introduces its own set of quiet complications. If many UFO sightings are indeed advanced human technology, Why do they often appear in ways that lead to confusion, even among trained military personnel? Why are pilots and radar operators sometimes unaware of systems that are being tested in the same airspace? The mainstream answer points to compartmentalization. In highly classified programs, information is restricted on a need-to-know basis. Not everyone within the same organization is aware of all ongoing projects. This is a well-documented aspect of defense operations. It allows sensitive technologies to be developed without widespread exposure. But it also creates situations where even highly trained observers may encounter something unfamiliar within their own operational environment. There is also the question of consistency across different regions and time periods. If advanced human technology accounts for a large portion of UFO sightings, we might expect those sightings to correlate closely with known testing locations or specific technological eras. And in many cases, they do. But there are also reports that span decades and occur in regions with varying levels of technological development. This does not invalidate the explanation, but it suggests that it may be part of a larger mosaic rather than a complete solution. Another layer to consider is how modern technology is changing the nature of these observations. The rise of unmanned aerial systems, or drones, has introduced a new category of objects that can appear highly unusual to those unfamiliar with their capabilities. Drones can hover, change direction rapidly, and operate in ways that traditional aircraft cannot. They can also be small, difficult to detect, and capable of operating in coordinated groups. The mainstream explanation increasingly points to drones as a source of many recent sightings, particularly those involving lights or formations that behave in unconventional ways. This is a strong and evolving explanation, grounded in observable technology that continues to advance rapidly. And yet, even here, the pattern does not fully settle. Some reported behaviors still exceed what is publicly demonstrated, particularly in terms of speed, acceleration, and endurance. This does not mean such capabilities are impossible. It means that if they exist, they are either in early stages of development, highly classified, or perhaps misinterpreted in ways that amplify their apparent performance. The careful approach is to hold all of these possibilities in view without rushing toward a conclusion. What becomes increasingly clear as we explore this layer is that the line between the known and the unknown is not always where we think it is. Technology that feels futuristic or even implausible today may become commonplace tomorrow, and technology that exists today may remain hidden long enough to be mistaken for something entirely different. This shifting boundary creates a kind of moving horizon, where the explanation for certain sightings may change over time as new information becomes available. So as the night continues and the details begin to settle into a quieter understanding, it may be helpful to consider that the mystery of UFOs is not necessarily about objects that defy the laws of physics, but about objects that exist at the edge of our current knowledge, whether that knowledge is limited by perception, by technology, or by the way information is shared. Advanced human technology offers a grounded and historically supported explanation for many aspects of the phenomenon. But like all explanations in this space, it leaves certain questions open, not because it is insufficient, but because the subject itself is layered and complex. And perhaps that is the most important thing to carry forward as we move into the next part of this journey. The understanding that explanations do not have to be mutually exclusive. Some sightings may be misidentified natural phenomena, others may involve human-made technology, and some may remain unresolved for reasons we do not yet fully understand. The goal is not to choose a single answer, but to explore how each piece fits into the larger picture, slowly, carefully, and without losing sight of the quiet curiosity that brought us here in the first place. As we continue deeper into this slow unfolding, it becomes time to examine one of the most quietly intriguing dimensions of the UFO subject: the possibility that some of these phenomena may not fit neatly into the categories we've already explored, not because they are necessarily extraordinary, but because they may involve aspects of the natural world that are still not fully understood or widely recognized. This is perhaps the least discussed explanation, and yet, in many ways, one of the most grounded. Because history has shown, again and again, that nature is capable of producing effects that appear unusual, even impossible, until they are studied carefully and placed into the right context. The mainstream scientific perspective strongly supports this approach. Many UFO sightings have been convincingly explained as atmospheric or astronomical phenomena. Bright planets like Venus, for example, are responsible for a significant number of reports due to their brightness and tendency to appear low on the horizon, where atmospheric distortion can cause them to shimmer, shift color, or appear to move. Under the right conditions, even stars can seem to pulse or drift, especially when viewed through layers of turbulent air. These effects are subtle, but when combined with darkness and lack of reference points, they can become surprisingly convincing. There are also more complex atmospheric phenomena that can produce unusual visual effects. Temperature inversions, for instance, can bend light in ways that create mirage-like images of distant objects, making them appear elevated, distorted, or even moving. Electrical phenomena, such as ball lightning, remain only partially understood and have been reported as glowing, free-moving spheres that behave in unpredictable ways. Plasma formations in the upper atmosphere can produce luminous shapes that shift and fade without clear structure. From a mainstream standpoint, these explanations are not speculative. They are grounded in physics, even if not fully understood in every detail. They demonstrate that the natural world still contains behaviors that can surprise us, especially when observed under uncommon conditions. But as with every layer we've explored, this explanation, while strong, does not resolve everything. Some reported sightings involve structured shapes, consistent movement patterns, or durations that seem difficult to reconcile with known natural phenomena. This does not mean those sightings are beyond explanation. It simply means that either the natural processes involved are more complex than currently understood, or that multiple factors are interacting in ways that produce unexpected results. For example, a distant aircraft combined with atmospheric distortion and changing light conditions could create an appearance that feels far more structured than it actually is. The challenge is that these combinations are often difficult to reconstruct after the fact, leaving behind only the initial observation and the interpretation that followed. There is also an interesting overlap between natural phenomena and technological detection systems. Radar, infrared sensors, and other instruments are designed to interpret signals based on known parameters. When those signals fall outside expected patterns, they can produce anomalies that are difficult to classify. The mainstream explanation suggests that some UFO detections may be the result of environmental interference, weather conditions, electromagnetic effects, or even biological activity such as flocks of birds or swarms of insects interacting with radar in unusual ways. These explanations are supported by known behaviors of detection systems, which are not infallible and can produce unexpected results under certain conditions. And yet, the interaction between natural phenomena and technology introduces a layer of complexity that is not always easy to resolve. When a visual sighting aligns with a sensor anomaly, the question becomes whether both are responding to the same natural cause, or whether one is reinforcing the interpretation of the other. This is where the boundary between explanation and uncertainty becomes less distinct. The data points exist, but their relationship is not always clear. Another aspect worth considering is how rarely we observe the natural world under truly unusual conditions. Most of our understanding is based on repeatable, predictable environments. But the atmosphere, in particular, is a dynamic system capable of producing rare and transient effects that may only occur under very specific circumstances. These events may not be well documented simply because they are difficult to capture and even more difficult to study in real time. From a mainstream perspective, this suggests that some UFO sightings could represent encounters with natural phenomena that are not yet fully categorized, rather than something entirely outside the known world. There is also a quieter, more philosophical layer to this explanation, one that does not rely on extraordinary claims at all. It suggests that the mystery of UFOs may, in part, reflect the limits of human familiarity with the environment we inhabit. We tend to think of the natural world as largely understood, but that understanding is uneven. Some domains, like planetary motion or basic atmospheric behavior, are well mapped. Others, particularly those involving complex interactions of energy, light, and matter, still contain gaps. These gaps do not imply anything beyond nature. They simply indicate that our knowledge is still evolving. And perhaps this is where the calmest and most grounded perspective begins to take shape. UFOs, in many cases, may not be visitors, nor secret machines, nor purely psychological events, but rather moments where the natural world behaves in ways that intersect with human perception at just the right angle to create something unfamiliar. A convergence of conditions, light, motion, environment, expectation, that produces an experience that feels significant precisely because it is rare. But even this perspective, as grounded as it is, does not close the subject completely, because there remain cases where the characteristics described do not align easily with known natural processes. These cases sit quietly at the edge of the explanation, not contradicting it, but not fully contained by it either, and so the pattern continues, each explanation illuminating part of the picture while leaving other parts in shadow. So as the night deepens and the ideas begin to settle into a softer, more reflective rhythm, it may be worth considering that the mystery of UFOs does not necessarily point outward, towards something distant or unknown, but inward, toward the boundaries of our own understanding of the world around us. The sky above us is not empty, and it is not fully mapped. It is a dynamic, complex system that we are still learning to interpret, even with all the tools at our disposal. And in that quiet space between what we recognize and what we do not, between the familiar and the unexpected, the phenomenon continues, not as a single unanswered question, but as a collection of moments that invite us to look a little more closely, to think a little more carefully, and to remain just open enough to the possibility that there is still more to understand. As we continue this slow and steady exploration, it becomes time to examine one of the most quietly influential forces shaping the UFO phenomenon. Not something seen in the sky, but something that exists within human systems. The role of media, storytelling, and collective interpretation. Because while sightings may begin as isolated observations, it is the way those observations are shared, repeated, and framed that determines how they are understood over time. And in many ways, the evolution of the UFO narrative tells us as much about human communication as it does about the phenomenon itself. The mainstream explanation begins with a simple and grounded idea. Information changes as it spreads. This is not unique to UFOs. It applies to all forms of reporting, especially when the original data is incomplete or ambiguous. A witness describes a light. A journalist interprets the description. A headline simplifies it. An audience reacts to it. Each step introduces small shifts in emphasis, detail, and tone. Over time, these shifts accumulate, creating a version of the event that may differ significantly from the original observation. In the case of UFOs, where the initial data is often already uncertain, this process can amplify the sense of mystery without necessarily adding new information. One of the earliest and most influential examples of this process can be traced back to the coverage following sightings, like those reported by Kenneth Arnold. His description of objects moving like a saucer skipping across water was interpreted by the media as a reference to shape rather than motion, leading to the widespread adoption of the term flying saucer. This single shift in interpretation had a lasting impact, shaping how people visualized and reported UFOs for decades. The mainstream perspective sees this as a clear example of how language influences perception. Once a particular image enters the public consciousness, it becomes a reference point for future observations, even if it was based on a misunderstanding. As media technology evolved, so did the speed and scale at which UFO stories spread. In the mid-20th century, newspapers and radio were the primary channels, allowing stories to circulate nationally and sometimes internationally. By the time television became widespread, visual representation added a new layer of influence. Images, reenactments, and dramatizations gave form to what had previously been described only in words. This made the phenomenon more accessible, but also more susceptible to interpretation. The mainstream explanation emphasizes that visual media can both clarify and distort. A compelling image can make a story feel more real, even if the underlying evidence remains ambiguous. In the modern era, with digital platforms and global connectivity, this process has accelerated dramatically. A single sighting can be recorded, uploaded, and viewed by millions within hours. Analysis begins almost immediately, with experts and amateurs alike offering interpretations. This rapid dissemination has both advantages and challenges. On one hand, it allows for quicker cross-referencing, broader scrutiny, and the potential for collaborative investigation. On the other hand, it increases the risk of misinformation, misinterpretation, and deliberate fabrication. The mainstream perspective highlights that the volume of data has increased, but the reliability of that data varies widely. Sorting meaningful information from noise has become more complex than ever. Another important factor is the role of narrative frameworks. People tend to organize information into stories, and those stories often follow familiar patterns. In the case of UFOs, certain themes recur: mysterious lights, unexplained movements, official denial, hidden truth. These elements form a narrative structure that is easy to recognize and repeat. The mainstream explanation suggests that once this structure is established, new reports are often interpreted within it, even if the details differ. This does not mean the reports are false. It means they are shaped by the context in which they are received and retold. There is also the phenomenon of feedback between media and witnesses. As stories become more widely known, they influence how future witnesses describe their experiences. This can create a kind of convergence where independent reports begin to share similar language and imagery. The mainstream interpretation sees this as further evidence of cultural influence, but it also introduces a more subtle question. If a genuine phenomenon exists, how do we distinguish between the core observation and the layers of interpretation added by media and culture? This is not an easy question to answer, and it remains one of the central challenges in studying UFOs. At the same time, it is important to recognize that media does not only amplify uncertainty, it can also reduce it. Investigative journalism, documentary analysis, and the release of verified information have all contributed to a more structured understanding of certain cases. The confirmation of military footage, the publication of official reports, and the involvement of credible institutions have helped shift the conversation toward a more measured and evidence-based approach. The mainstream perspective views this as a positive development, one that moves the subject away from speculation and toward analysis. And yet, even with these advancements, the narrative aspect of UFOs remains powerful. Stories have a way of persisting, evolving, and adapting over time. They carry emotional weight, cultural significance, and a sense of continuity that pure data often lacks. This does not make them unreliable, but it does mean they must be interpreted with care. The story is not the same as the event. It is a reflection of how the event is understood. If we step back and look at the broader pattern, the role of media reveals something fundamental about the UFO phenomenon. It is not just a collection of sightings. It is a shared experience shaped by communication, interpretation, and collective memory. Each report becomes part of a larger narrative, one that is continuously rewritten as new information emerges and old assumptions are revisited. And so, as the night continues and the ideas begin to settle into a quieter understanding, it may be helpful to consider that the mystery of UFOs is not only in what is seen, but in how it is told. The sky provides the initial moment of uncertainty, but it is here, in the exchange of information, that the mystery takes on its enduring form. The way we describe, share, and interpret these experiences shapes the phenomenon just as much as the experiences themselves. Because in the end, the story of UFOs is not just about objects moving through the sky. It is about the movement of ideas through human systems, how they begin, how they change, and how they persist. And within that movement, there is a kind of quiet complexity, one that invites us to listen carefully, to question gently, and to remain aware that what we are hearing is always a combination of observation and interpretation, woven together over time. As we continue moving gently through this layered subject, it becomes time to explore one of the most persistent and quietly fascinating elements of the UFO phenomenon, the idea that, even after decades of observation, investigation, and technological advancement, the unknown portion has not disappeared. It has not been fully resolved, reduced, or explained away entirely. Instead, it has remained, sometimes shrinking, sometimes expanding, but never quite reaching zero. And that persistence in itself becomes something worth examining carefully. The mainstream perspective offers a grounded starting point for this. It suggests that in any large data set of observations, especially those involving complex environments like the sky, there will always be a percentage of cases that remain unexplained due to incomplete data. This is not unique to UFOs. It happens in meteorology, in aviation, in even the most well-studied scientific fields. Instruments fail. Observations are partial. Conditions change too quickly to capture everything needed for a full analysis. From this viewpoint, the existence of unresolved cases is not surprising. It is expected. And as technology improves, that percentage should gradually decrease, even if it never fully disappears. But when we look at the historical record, something slightly more nuanced begins to emerge. Despite improvements in radar systems, imaging technology, satellite coverage, and data analysis, the category of unidentified has persisted. It has changed shape over time, influenced by new tools and new frameworks, but it has not been eliminated. The mainstream explanation holds that this is simply because new types of ambiguity replace old ones. As we solve one set of problems, we uncover another. Each advancement brings clarity, but also reveals new layers of complexity. This is a natural part of scientific progress. And yet, the persistence of the unknown invites a quieter question. Is the phenomenon itself evolving alongside our ability to observe it? Or are we simply becoming more aware of the limits of our own systems? There is also an interesting pattern in how unresolved cases are distributed. They are not evenly spread across all reports. Instead, they tend to cluster in situations where data is incomplete, where multiple variables are at play, or where observation conditions are less than ideal. This supports the mainstream view that uncertainty arises from complexity, rather than from something inherently inexplicable. But it also highlights a subtle point. The most intriguing cases are often those where the available data is just enough to raise questions, but not enough to answer them. They sit in a kind of middle ground, where explanation feels possible, but remains just out of reach. Another aspect to consider is how the definition of unidentified has changed over time. In earlier decades, many sightings remained unexplained simply because the necessary tools or knowledge were not available. Today, with more advanced systems and broader scientific understanding, some of those cases might be resolved more easily. But at the same time, modern technology has introduced new categories of observations: infrared signatures, radar anomalies, high-altitude detections, that bring their own forms of uncertainty. The mainstream explanation sees this as a shifting baseline. What counts as unexplained is not fixed. It depends on the current state of knowledge and technology. There is also a psychological dimension to the persistence of the unknown. Humans are naturally drawn to unresolved questions, especially those that challenge our sense of understanding. The existence of unexplained cases can create a sense of intrigue that extends beyond the data itself. This does not mean the cases are more significant than they appear. It means that the lack of resolution carries its own weight, shaping how the phenomenon is perceived and discussed. The mainstream perspective reminds us to separate the emotional impact of uncertainty from the evidence itself. But it also acknowledges that uncertainty, when it persists, becomes part of the phenomenon's identity. If we step back and look at this pattern more broadly, the persistence of unexplained cases suggests something about the nature of the subject as a whole. It is not static. It does not move steadily toward a final answer. Instead, it exists in a dynamic balance between explanation and uncertainty. Each new piece of information shifts that balance slightly, but never completely resolves it. This does not imply anything extraordinary. It simply reflects the complexity of the system we are trying to understand. And perhaps this is where the discussion becomes most quietly compelling, because it suggests that the UFO phenomenon may not be something that can be fully solved in the traditional sense. It may be more like a horizon, something that moves as we move, always present, always just beyond complete reach. Not because it is deliberately hidden, but because it exists at the edge of multiple overlapping systems: perception, technology, environment, and interpretation. There is also a practical implication to this perspective. If the unknown is a persistent feature rather than a temporary gap, then the goal of investigation shifts slightly. It becomes less about eliminating uncertainty entirely and more about managing it, understanding its sources, and reducing it where possible. This is how many scientific fields operate when dealing with complex or unpredictable phenomena. They do not expect to remove all ambiguity. They aim to narrow it, to define it, and to work within it. And so, as the night continues and the ideas settle into a quieter, more reflective space, it may be worth considering that the most enduring secret of UFOs is not a hidden object or a concealed truth, but the simple fact that the unknown remains. Not as a failure of understanding, but as a natural part of how we engage with a world that is more complex than any single explanation can capture. Because in the end, the persistence of the unknown is not something to be feared or dismissed. It is something to be approached with patience, with curiosity, and with a willingness to accept that some questions take longer to unfold than others. And in that slow unfolding, there is a kind of quiet clarity, not in having all the answers, but in understanding the shape of the questions themselves. As we continue to settle deeper into this calm, unfolding exploration, it becomes time to look at something even more subtle: the long-term pattern of how UFOs move in and out of public attention, almost like a quiet tide that rises, recedes, and then returns again. Because one of the most curious aspects of this phenomenon is not just that it exists, but that it seems to follow cycles of visibility, periods where it feels almost forgotten, followed by moments where it suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. The mainstream explanation for this pattern is grounded in social dynamics rather than anything happening in the sky itself. Public interest tends to rise when new information is introduced, whether through declassified documents, credible witness testimony, or confirmed footage, and then gradually fade as attention shifts elsewhere. This is how many topics behave, especially those that are complex and lack definitive answers. Without resolution, sustained attention becomes difficult. People move on, not because the subject has been solved, but because it has reached a temporary plateau where no new conclusions can be drawn. But when we look more closely, the timing of these cycles becomes quietly interesting. The late 1940s and 1950s saw an explosion of sightings and public concern, followed by a gradual decline as official explanations and cultural normalization took hold. Then, decades later, interest resurged at various points, often tied to new releases of information or renewed institutional acknowledgement. In recent years, the topic has returned again, this time with a slightly different tone, less sensational, more analytical, and more grounded in official reporting. The mainstream perspective attributes this to changing attitudes, improved data, and reduced stigma, and that explanation fits well. But it also raises a softer question. Are these cycles driven entirely by human attention, or do they reflect changes in how often these events are being observed and recorded? Another layer to this pattern involves generational shifts. Each generation encounters the UFO subject in a slightly different context. For some, it was shaped by early reports and Cold War uncertainty. For others, it was influenced by media portrayals and cultural narratives. More recently, it has been framed through official statements, verified footage, and scientific discussion. The core phenomenon may remain similar, but the lens through which it is viewed changes over time. The mainstream explanation sees this as a natural evolution of perspective. As knowledge advances and cultural context shifts, so does interpretation. But it also means that the same underlying observations can lead to very different conclusions depending on when and how they are encountered. There is also an interesting relationship between uncertainty and attention. When a topic is completely unknown, it attracts curiosity. When it is fully understood, it becomes part of the background. But when it exists in between, partially explained, partially unresolved, it tends to linger in a unique space. It is not urgent enough to demand constant focus, but not resolved enough to disappear entirely. UFOs occupy this middle ground almost perfectly. The mainstream view would say that this is precisely why the subject persists. It is sustained not by answers, but by the absence of complete answers. And then there is the role of institutional acknowledgement, which seems to act as a kind of anchor point for these cycles. When organizations like the Pentagon confirm that certain incidents remain unidentified, it does not provide a conclusion, but it does validate the existence of the question. This validation shifts the conversation slightly, making it more acceptable to examine the topic without immediately dismissing it. The mainstream explanation for this shift is rooted in transparency and practicality. As data improves and stigma decreases, there is less reason to avoid the subject. But from another angle, it suggests that the boundary between what is publicly acknowledged and what is privately studied may be slowly narrowing. There is also a quieter pattern within these cycles that is easy to overlook. Each time the subject returns to public attention, it tends to do so with a slightly different emphasis. Early discussions focused on the objects themselves, what they looked like, how they moved. Later conversations began to include the reliability of witnesses, the role of technology, and the influence of perception. More recently, the focus has shifted toward data analysis, institutional response, and scientific methodology. The phenomenon has not necessarily changed, but the way we approach it has become more structured, more careful, and perhaps more grounded. This gradual shift in approach may be one of the most important developments of all, because it suggests that, over time, the conversation is moving away from extremes and toward a more balanced perspective. Instead of asking whether UFOs are proof of something extraordinary or dismissing them outright, the discussion is becoming more about understanding the layers involved: perception, technology, environment, and interpretation. The mainstream view supports this shift as a sign of maturity in how the subject is handled. It reflects a move toward evidence-based analysis rather than speculation. And yet, even as the conversation becomes more refined, the cycles themselves continue. Interest rises, new information emerges, questions are asked, and then, slowly, attention fades again. Not because the questions have been answered, but because they remain open. This rhythm creates a kind of continuity, a sense that the phenomenon is always present, even when it is not at the forefront of public awareness. So as the night deepens and the ideas begin to settle into a softer, more reflective space, it may be worth considering that the UFO phenomenon is not just a mystery to be solved, but a pattern to be observed, not only in the sky, but in the way it moves through human attention over time. It appears, it recedes, and it returns, each time carrying a slightly different set of questions, a slightly different tone, but always the same underlying sense of something not yet fully understood. And in that quiet cycle, there is something almost calming. Not because it provides answers, but because it reminds us that not all questions need to be resolved immediately. Some can remain, gently unfolding across years and decades, inviting us to look again, to think again, and to approach the unknown with a little more patience each time it returns. As we begin to approach the final stretch of this long, quiet journey, it becomes time to step back and look at the UFO phenomenon as a whole, not as a collection of individual cases, explanations, or patterns, but as something that exists across all of them at once. Something that reveals itself not in any single detail, but in the way those details connect, overlap, and sometimes contradict each other in subtle ways. Because after everything we've explored, the sightings, the technology, the psychology, the natural phenomena, the institutional responses, what remains is not a single answer, but a kind of structure, a shape that begins to form when all these elements are held together at the same time. The mainstream perspective, when viewed from this wider angle, remains consistent in its caution. It suggests that the UFO phenomenon is not a unified mystery, but a category, a label applied to a wide range of observations that have not yet been identified. Within that category, there are multiple explanations operating simultaneously. Some sightings are misidentified aircraft, others are atmospheric effects. Some may involve advanced human technology, and some remain unresolved due to incomplete data. This layered explanation is not only reasonable, it is supported by decades of analysis. It does not require a single cause because the evidence does not point clearly toward one. Instead, it reflects the complexity of the real world, where different factors can produce similar outcomes under different conditions. But when we hold that explanation alongside everything else we've discussed, a quieter question begins to take shape. If the phenomenon is purely a collection of unrelated causes, why does it feel so consistent across time? Why do similar descriptions, similar patterns, and similar uncertainties appear again and again, even as technology, culture, and understanding continue to change? The mainstream answer would point to the consistency of human perception and the recurring nature of environmental conditions. We see the same patterns because we process the world in similar ways, and because the world itself presents similar stimuli under similar circumstances. That explanation is strong. But it also leaves open the possibility that there may be some underlying continuity that has not yet been fully recognized. There is also the matter of how the phenomenon behaves when examined closely. In many cases, the closer we get to a potential explanation, the more the details seem to shift or dissolve into ambiguity. A light becomes a reflection, a shape becomes a distortion, a movement becomes a matter of perspective. This is exactly what we would expect if most sightings are the result of misinterpretation. But it also creates a kind of pattern where the phenomenon consistently sits just beyond the point of full clarity, not because it is deliberately hidden, but because it exists in a space where observation, interpretation, and environment intersect in ways that are difficult to separate completely. Another important element in this broader view is the role of uncertainty itself. Throughout this journey, uncertainty has appeared not as a flaw, but as a constant feature. It is present in perception, in technology, in data, and in interpretation. The mainstream perspective treats this as a natural outcome of studying complex and transient phenomena. But when uncertainty persists across multiple layers and over long periods of time, it begins to feel less like a temporary gap and more like an intrinsic part of the subject. Not something to be eliminated entirely, but something to be understood and managed. There is also a sense, when looking at the phenomenon as a whole, that it resists simplification. Each time we try to reduce it to a single explanation, it expands again, revealing new variables, new contexts, and new questions. This does not suggest anything extraordinary. It suggests that the subject is inherently multi-layered, shaped by a combination of factors that do not easily collapse into one category. In this way, UFOs may be less like a single mystery and more like a system, a complex interaction between human perception, environmental conditions, technological capability, and the limits of current knowledge. And perhaps this is where the most grounded and thoughtful perspective begins to emerge. Not one that seeks a final answer, but one that recognizes the value of the process itself. The careful examination of evidence, the willingness to consider multiple explanations, the patience to sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. These are not just tools for understanding UFOs. They are tools for understanding any complex phenomenon. So as you rest there, letting the ideas settle gently into place, it may be worth considering that the true significance of the UFO phenomenon is not found in any single sighting or theory, but in the way it encourages a particular kind of thinking. A thinking that is attentive, balanced, and open without being uncritical. A thinking that values questions as much as answers, and that understands that not all mysteries are meant to be solved quickly, or perhaps even completely. Because in the end, what we are left with is not a conclusion, but a perspective, a way of looking at the sky and at the unknown that is calm, curious, and grounded. The lights may appear, the questions may return, and the patterns may continue to unfold. But the approach remains the same: slow, careful, thoughtful. And as we prepare to move into the final part of this journey, there is a certain quiet clarity in that. Not the clarity of having solved the mystery, but the clarity of understanding how to live with it, how to explore it, and how to let it remain what it is. A question that continues, gently and persistently, just beyond the edge of certainty. And now, as we arrive at the final part of this long, quiet journey, it becomes time not to reach for a dramatic conclusion, but to let everything we've explored settle into a single, calm perspective. One that does not force an answer, but allows the shape of the mystery to reveal itself naturally, almost effortlessly, in the space between what we know and what we do not. Because if we trace the path we've taken, from early sightings and historical cases, through military encounters, scientific analysis, perception, technology, natural phenomena, and the role of media and institutions, we begin to see that the UFO phenomenon is not a single question waiting for a single answer. It is something more subtle than that. It is a convergence, a meeting point between multiple layers of reality and interpretation, each one incomplete on its own, but together forming something that feels persistent, structured, and quietly unresolved. The mainstream explanation, when viewed in its full depth, remains strong and grounded. Most sightings can be explained through known causes: misidentified aircraft, atmospheric effects, technological artifacts, and the limitations of human perception. This is not only likely, it is expected. The world is complex, and our ability to interpret it is imperfect. When we look up into the night sky, we are not just observing objects. We are interpreting light, motion, and distance through a system that is designed to make sense of uncertainty, sometimes by simplifying it, sometimes by filling in gaps. And yet, even after acknowledging all of this, something remains. Not something dramatic, not something that demands immediate explanation, but something consistent. A small percentage of cases, scattered across time and geography, that resist easy classification. Cases where multiple observers report similar details. Cases where instruments and perception seem to align, even if only partially. Cases where explanations can be proposed, but not fully confirmed. These are not proof of anything extraordinary, but they are also not entirely dismissible. They exist in that quiet middle space, where the known and the unknown overlap. And perhaps the most important realization is this: that space may always exist. Not because there is something deliberately hidden from us, but because of the nature of observation itself. The world we experience is filtered through layers: sensory, technological, cognitive. And each of those layers introduces its own limits. We do not see reality directly. We see interpretations of it, constructed in real time, shaped by context, expectation, and the tools we use to measure it. UFOs, in this sense, are not just objects or events. They are moments where those layers become visible, where the gap between what is there and what we understand becomes just wide enough to notice. This does not make the phenomenon supernatural. It makes it human. It reflects the edges of our knowledge, the boundaries of our systems, and the way those boundaries shift over time. What was once unexplained may become understood. What is understood today may reveal new questions tomorrow. The horizon moves, not because the truth is retreating, but because our perspective is expanding. And so, when we ask what UFOs really are, the calmest and most grounded answer may be this: they are a category of experience shaped by multiple causes, filtered through human perception, and sustained by the natural presence of uncertainty in a complex world. Some are mistakes, some are misinterpretations, some may involve technology not widely recognized, some may involve natural phenomena not fully studied, and some remain, for now, simply unidentified. Not because they are unknowable, but because they have not yet been fully understood. There is no need to rush beyond that, because the value of this journey has not been in arriving at a final conclusion, but in learning how to navigate a question that does not yet have one, to remain curious without becoming ungrounded, to consider possibilities without accepting them prematurely, to recognize patterns without forcing them into certainty. And perhaps, as you lie there now, letting the last of these thoughts settle gently into place, there is something quietly reassuring in that. The idea that not everything needs to be resolved immediately, that some mysteries can exist without demanding belief or dismissal, that the unknown is not something to fear, but something to observe, patiently and carefully, as it slowly reveals its contours over time. The sky above has always held more than we fully understand, not because it is hiding something extraordinary, but because it is vast, dynamic, and still being explored. And within that sky, there will always be moments brief, subtle, and difficult to explain, where something appears, moves, and disappears, leaving behind not an answer, but a question, a quiet question, one that does not insist, one that does not rush, one that simply remains. And maybe, in the end, that is the most relaxing truth of all. Not that the mystery has been solved, but that it does not need to be, and that we can rest comfortably in the space between knowing and wondering, where curiosity drifts softly and the night sky remains just a little bit deeper than it seems.